She built a billion-dollar empire with her bare hands, chose her husband because he made her daughter laugh and never once raised his voice, but the night 4 armed men broke into their home, the man she thought she knew completely moved through that darkness like a ghost, silent, lethal, and terrifyingly precise. And when the dust settled, a federal agent knocked on her door and told her the man she married didn't legally exist. If you love your mom and dad and believe that real love is worth fighting for no matter what secrets stand between two people, hit that subscribe button right now and show them some love. This one is for every family that held together when the truth tried to tear them apart. Diana Mercer had never needed saving. Not once in her 38 years on this earth had she stood in a room and felt like she was the weakest person in it. She had clawed her way out of a one-bedroom apartment in Cincinnati at the age of 19 with nothing but a scholarship, a second-hand laptop, and a stubbornness that her mother used to call both her greatest gift and her most dangerous flaw. By 26 she had co-founded a cybersecurity tech startup in Chicago. By 32, she had bought out her co-founder, rebranded the company as Mercer Tech, and taken it public on the NASDAQ. By 35, Forbes had put her on its cover with the headline, "The Most Dangerous Woman in Silicon Midwest." She had read that headline sitting alone in her office at midnight, eating a cold slice of pizza, and she had laughed until she cried because dangerous was the last thing she felt. What she felt was exhausted. What she felt was lonely. What she felt, if she was being completely honest with herself, was like she had built a magnificent castle and forgotten to leave a door open for anyone she actually loved. She had been married once before, briefly and disastrously, to a man named Carter Walsh who was charming at parties and absent everywhere else. The divorce had been clean but the damage had not been, and the most important thing Carter had ever done in his entire life was give Diana a daughter named Lily. Lily was 7 years old when Diana met James Calloway, and she was the most perceptive child Diana had ever encountered. Lily could read a room the way some people read weather patterns, instinctively, accurately, and always a few minutes before everyone else. So when Lily decided, within 45 minutes of meeting James at a mutual friend's backyard barbecue in Evanston, that she liked him, Diana paid attention. Lily had never warmed to any man Diana had introduced her to. She had been polite and distant with all of them. But with James she sat down next to him at the picnic table, looked at the paper plate he was holding, and said very seriously, "You put the coleslaw on top of the baked beans. That's actually the correct way to do it." And James had looked at her with complete gravity and said, "I've been waiting 3 years for someone to finally understand that." From that moment, they were inseparable for the rest of the afternoon, and Diana stood at a distance watching her daughter laugh in a way she hadn't laughed in longer than Diana could remember, and she felt something shift quietly and permanently inside her chest. James Calloway was not what anyone would have called a flashy man. He was 39, broad-shouldered, with short dark hair that was just beginning to go silver at the temples and a pair of steel blue eyes that had a quality Diana could never quite name, not cold, not distant, but deeply still, like a lake surface on a windless morning. He was handsome in an understated way that you noticed more the longer you looked at him rather than less. He smiled easily but not constantly. He listened when people spoke, actually listened, not the performative listening Diana had grown used to from business associates and media personalities who were merely waiting for their turn to talk. He worked as an independent safety consultant for mid-size companies, which Diana later understood was a deliberately vague job description, and he lived in a clean, simply furnished apartment in Lincoln Park with a coffee maker that looked like it cost more than his couch and a bookshelf that went floor to ceiling and covered an entire wall. He had no social media presence of any kind. He said he found it exhausting. Diana, who spent half her professional life managing her company's digital brand, found this both strange and deeply refreshing. They dated for 14 months before he proposed. It was not a grand gesture. He did not hire a skywriter or fill a restaurant with flowers. He made her dinner at his apartment on a Thursday evening in November, a meal that took him 4 hours to prepare and was one of the finest things Diana had ever eaten, and afterward they sat on his couch with the city lights coming through the window and he turned to her and said, "I want to keep doing this for the rest of my life." I want to keep making you dinner on Thursday nights and watching Lily try to teach the dog Spanish and waking up next to you until I physically cannot anymore. Will you let me?" Diana had told herself she would not cry. She cried. She said yes before she was even finished crying, and he held her face in his hands and looked at her with those still, steady eyes and said, "Good." I was running out of impressive Thursday meals. They were married 8 months later in a small ceremony at a vineyard in Galena, Illinois. 40 guests. Lily was the flower girl and took the role so seriously that she made a rehearsal schedule for herself and practiced her pedal-dropping technique for 2 weeks beforehand. Diana's mother flew in from Cincinnati and spent most of the reception telling anyone who would listen that James was the first man her daughter had ever brought home who shook her hand and then immediately asked if she needed a glass of water because she looked like she'd had a long flight. He had, Diana's mother said, the manners of a general and the heart of a pastor, and she approved completely. Diana had laughed at the manners of a general more than she'd expected to. Later, much later, she would think about that phrase very differently. For 2 years, their life was extraordinary in its ordinariness and Diana loved every moment of it. James had moved into her home in Lincoln Park, a beautiful restored brownstone that Diana had renovated top to bottom when she bought it 5 years earlier. He adapted to her world without complaint and without performance. He cooked most nights because he genuinely enjoyed it and because Diana's cooking was, by her own cheerful admission, a public safety hazard. He handled school drop-offs on the days Diana had early board calls. He knew every one of Lily's teachers by name and remembered which ones preferred email over phone calls. He went to every parent-teacher conference, every school play, every soccer game, sitting in the bleachers in his jacket with a thermos of coffee, occasionally explaining the offside rule to confused parents around him with the patient clarity of someone who had once briefed teams under considerable pressure. He was, by every visible measure, exactly what he appeared to be. A calm, devoted, capable man who loved his wife and his stepdaughter and was very good at making people feel safe. Diana, to her credit, did sometimes sense that there were rooms inside James that remained closed to her. Not in a way that frightened her. More in the way that a house can have a locked room that you know exists but have never felt unwelcome to ask about. She knew he had served in the military in his late 20s. He had mentioned it once, early in their relationship, and described it as some government work that he had done for several years before transitioning to the private sector. He didn't elaborate and she hadn't pushed, partly because she respected his privacy and partly because the version of James she knew, present, warm, steady, whole, made it difficult to imagine him as someone shaped by anything violent or dark. She had made a quiet assumption that his military service had been administrative or technical, something that matched the composed and methodical man she shared a life with. She had been, she would later understand, profoundly wrong. It was a Tuesday in late March, one of those cold gray Chicago evenings that can't decide whether to be winter or spring, and Diana was in her home office on the 3rd floor finishing a call with her CFO about a pending acquisition. Lily was in her room down the hall, doing homework with the dog beside her. James was downstairs in the kitchen, washing dishes from dinner, and Diana could hear the faint sound of water running and the occasional clink of a glass from 2 floors up, which was one of those small domestic sounds she had come to associate entirely with the feeling of not being alone. The call was running long. Diana was tired. She was thinking about whether she had signed the documents her assistant had sent at noon. She was thinking about whether Lily had finished her book report. She was not thinking about anything being wrong because nothing in her home had ever been wrong in a way that 4 men in dark clothing and masks could make it wrong. She heard the back door first. Not a crash. A click. The specific sound of a lock that had been defeated rather than forced. Diana paused mid-sentence on her call. She told her CFO she would call back. She stood up from her desk and moved to the door of her office and opened it, and that was when she heard the silence from the kitchen where there had been running water 30 seconds before. The silence was total and immediate, and it was the wrong kind of silence, the kind that doesn't mean peace but means something is being held perfectly still by someone who knows how to hold things still. What happened in the next 4 minutes Diana would spend the rest of her life trying to fully reconstruct and never quite managing to. She heard movement. She heard one sharp impact sound, then another. She heard a man's voice say something that was cut off before it was finished. She was partway down the stairs when she saw James in the hallway, and the man she saw was and was not the man she had married. His posture was different. Every soft edge she associated with him, the slight looseness in his shoulders when he was relaxed, the openness in his expression when he was listening to Lily's stories, was gone, replaced by something geometric and absolute. He was moving with an efficiency that had no wasted motion in it whatsoever, and he was doing things with his hands and body that Diana's mind could not immediately categorize because they bore no resemblance to anything she had ever seen a person do in a domestic setting. One of the 4 men was already on the floor of the hallway. Another was against the wall. By the time Diana reached the bottom of the stairs, it was over. All 4 men were on the ground. The kitchen was barely disturbed. James was standing in the center of the hallway, breathing evenly, and he turned when he heard Diana's step on the last stair and his face shifted back, the geometry softened, and he looked at her with those still blue eyes and said, "Don't let Lily come downstairs." The police arrived in 6 minutes. Diana had called them from the stairs while James checked the men on the floor with a methodical calm that she recognized, in some distant part of her brain, as training rather than instinct. The officers who arrived first were young and visibly surprised by what they found. The lead detective who arrived 20 minutes later was not young and was not surprised in the same way. His name was Sergeant Robert Haynes, and he pulled Diana aside in her living room while his colleagues processed the scene, and he looked at her very directly and asked her how long she had known her husband. Diana said 2 years of marriage and 14 months before that. Haynes nodded slowly. He asked her if she knew what her husband had done for the government. Diana said he had told her he did some government work in his late 20s and she had assumed it was administrative. Haynes looked at her for a long moment and then said, very carefully, that the name James Calloway did not appear in any federal employment database he had access to, and that what he had just witnessed in this home was not something that came from administrative government work. Diana did not sleep that night. James sat with her in the kitchen after Lily was asleep and the police had gone and the house was quiet again, and he held both of her hands across the table and he told her. He told her all of it, or as much as the law he still technically existed within allowed him to tell, and he told it calmly and without apology but with a weight in his voice that she had never heard before and that told her this was something he had been carrying for a very long time. His real name was James Nathan Reeves. He had grown up in Knoxville, Tennessee, the son of a high school history teacher and a woman who ran a small landscaping business, and he had enlisted in the Army at 18 with the vague patriotic conviction of a young man who wanted to do something that mattered. He had been selected for Special Forces assessment at 22 and had passed, and from there his path had diverged so completely from anything ordinary that the man who had enlisted at 18 would not have recognized the man he became. He had spent 11 years in a special operations unit operating under a classified designation that he could not name, conducting missions in locations he was not permitted to specify, doing work that existed in the space between what governments officially did and what they actually needed done. He had been very good at it. He had been, he said, looking at the table rather than at Diana when he said it, among the best at it. And it had cost him in ways that took years to understand and more years to begin to address. At 33, while embedded in an operation targeting a cartel network that had developed connections to foreign intelligence services and was trafficking not only drugs but weapons-grade materials across the southern border, he had done something that made it impossible for him to continue existing as James Reeves. He had witnessed and documented the complicity of 3 senior federal officials in the network's operations. He had brought that documentation to the right people and those right people had done the right thing with it, and the 3 officials were eventually prosecuted in proceedings that were sealed and that most of the public had never heard about. But the cartel network had reach that extended beyond those 3 officials and that reach had a very specific and permanent interest in finding James Reeves. So James Reeves had been given a new name, a new history, a new city, and a new life, and he had been told to live it quietly and to stay off the radar and to be, in every way that anyone could observe, an ordinary man. He had done that. He had done it for 6 years. He had met Diana and had fallen in love in a way he had not thought was still available to him, had built a family he would have described in his former life as the kind of thing you dreamed about to stay functional during long operations in dark places, and he had, with the full knowledge that it was a risk, allowed himself to have it. The men who came on Tuesday were not random. They were connected to what remained of the network, which had reorganized under new leadership in the 2 years prior, and they had found him through a data breach at a private security firm whose client list included James's legitimate consulting business. The breach had exposed a set of financial records that, cross-referenced with certain physical descriptors from older intelligence files, had produced a match that was close enough to send 4 men to a brownstone in Lincoln Park on a cold Tuesday evening in March. Diana sat across from her husband and listened to all of this and felt many things simultaneously, and the feeling that surprised her most was not fear and was not anger, though both of those were present in full measure. The feeling that surprised her most was a strange and grief-adjacent recognition, as though some part of her had always known there was a room she hadn't been inside yet and was now finally standing in the doorway of it, looking at everything that had been kept there, understanding that it had been kept there not out of deception but out of a love so protective it had tried to put a wall between her and anything that might reach through his past to harm her. She looked at her husband's hand still holding hers across the table, and she thought about every Tuesday night dinner, every school pickup, every soccer game with the thermos of coffee, every night she had fallen asleep beside him feeling safer than she had ever felt in her life, and she understood that none of that had been a performance. All of it had been real. It had simply also been a man doing the most disciplined and determined thing he had ever done, which was learning, after a life built entirely around controlled violence and classified darkness, how to be ordinary, how to be soft, how to be home. Then the knock came at 6 in the morning. 2 people stood at Diana's front door in dark coats. A man and a woman, both in their 40s, both with the specific blank professional effect of people who spent their careers operating in spaces that required it. They showed credentials that Diana was not fast enough in the morning light to fully read. They asked to speak with James. James had known they would come. He had been sitting in the kitchen since 4, dressed, coffee made, and he came to the door and spoke with them in a low voice in the entryway while Diana stood at the base of the stairs and watched and understood that something was about to be asked of her husband that she was not going to like. The woman's name, she said, was Agent Carla Voss. She told James that the data breach had been wider than initially assessed. That his location was now known to a level of the organization that made his current residence untenable from a protection standpoint. That the agency was activating a relocation protocol and that he would need to come with them within the next 12 hours. James listened to all of this without expression. Then he turned and looked at Diana at the base of the stairs, and something moved across his face that Diana would remember for the rest of her life, a complete and total openness, no walls, no stillness, just a man who had spent his entire adult life being controlled and capable, standing in his own hallway in the early morning, unable to fully control the thing his face was doing, because what his face was doing was saying goodbye, and he knew it and she knew it. Diana Mercer had never needed saving. But she had, over the past 3.5 years, learned something she had not known before, which was that needing something and being saved were not the same thing, and that the bravest possible act was not the one performed in the dark with 4 men and no witnesses, but the one performed at a kitchen table with all the lights on, holding someone's hands and telling them everything true about yourself and trusting them to stay. She walked across the entryway. She stepped around Agent Voss. She stood directly in front of her husband and she took his face in her hands the same way he had taken hers the night he proposed, and she said, "Where they send you, I go. Where Lily and I go, you go. We are not a problem you protect people from. We are what you come home to, and if they want you, they take all of us, or they explain to me in very specific legal terms why they cannot, because I have 12 lawyers and I am not going back to sleep this morning." James looked at her for a long moment. There was something in his eyes that she had never seen there before, and it took her a moment to identify it because it was not an expression she had ever associated with him. It was relief. The specific and profound relief of a person who has spent years braced for the moment when the weight of what they are becomes too much for the person beside them, finally understanding that the moment has come and passed and the person beside them is still there, still holding on, still entirely and completely present. Agent Voss said, quietly, that the agency had anticipated this scenario and had a protocol for it. It took 11 days and involved a level of legal, logistical, and personal complexity that Diana later said made her largest corporate acquisition look like filing a parking permit. There were agreements signed and conditions established and security assessments conducted and identities restructured in ways that required Diana to temporarily operate Mercer Tech through a blind trust while certain arrangements were formalized. There were conversations with Lily that were among the hardest things Diana had ever done, and Lily, being Lily, listened to the entire age-appropriate version of the explanation with her characteristic grave attention and then said, "So Dad was like a superhero but a real one. And now we have to move somewhere safe. Do I get to pick my new bedroom?" She did get to pick her new bedroom. She chose a corner room with 2 windows. She said good morning to both windows every day for a week before deciding she preferred the one that faced east. The relocation was to a city Diana had always loved and had never expected to live in. New identities were created with the care and legal weight of a federal operation, and James became, in the relevant documents and records, exactly who he had always been to the people who mattered: Diana's husband, Lily's father, the man who put coleslaw on top of baked beans and made Thursday dinners that took 4 hours and sat in bleachers with a thermos of coffee explaining the offside rule. His past did not disappear. It was simply placed in its proper location, which was the past, where it belonged, accounted for and honored, and no longer a weight he carried alone. 6 months after the Tuesday night in March that changed everything, Diana sat in a new kitchen in a new city and watched James teach Lily how to make the particular pasta dish he said his grandmother had made every Sunday in Knoxville, and Lily was taking the lesson with the same grave seriousness she brought to everything and occasionally correcting him on measurements in a way that made him look at Diana over Lily's head with an expression of pure helpless love, and Diana thought about the man she thought she had married and the man she had actually married and understood that they were the same man. That all of it, the stillness, the steadiness, the capacity for complete presence, the ability to make a 7-year-old feel like the most important person in any room, all of it had come from the same place. That you could not have the softness without the strength that had learned how to become soft. That you could not have the safety without the person who had once moved through danger with such complete command that they understood, better than anyone, exactly what safety was worth. She had thought she married an ordinary man. She had been wrong. She had married an extraordinary one. And the extraordinary thing about him was not what he had done in the dark in places she would never know the names of. The extraordinary thing about him was what he had chosen to do in the light, every single day, in a kitchen in Lincoln Park with a thermos of coffee and a child who needed a father and a woman who had built an empire and forgotten to leave a door open, until he came along and knocked, and she let him in, and he stayed. He had said, that night at the table, that he had never lied about who he was. He had just not been able to tell her what he used to do. She understood now that those were not the same thing. That who a person is and what they have done are related but not identical. That the James who had neutralized 4 men in a hallway without raising his voice and the James who remembered which of Lily's teachers preferred email over phone calls were both entirely real, both entirely him, and that loving him fully meant holding both of those truths at the same time without flinching. She had never needed saving. But she had needed him. And he had needed her. And in the end, that turned out to be exactly enough. If you love your mom and dad and believe that real love doesn't run from the truth but walks straight toward it, hit that subscribe button right now and show them some love. Every story we tell here is for the families that chose to stay when staying was hard, and for the people who were brave enough to be known completely. Now drop a comment below and tell us, what part of the country are you watching from? We want to hear from every single state, every city, every small town. You are part of this community and we want to know where home is for you.